Welcome to today's webinar, Government Fleet Electrification, Lessons We've Learned So Far, presented by AssetWorks. I'm Manuela Colis, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point, and we will try to address them all. However, if we do not get to yours, don't worry, you will be contacted by email with the response after the event. I am joined by our speaker today, Mike Terreri, Senior EV Product Manager at AssetWorks. Thank you for being here, Mike. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and AssetWorks.
Fantastic. Well, good afternoon. And again, thank you for the opportunity to join. My name is Mike Terreri. I'm EV Product Manager at AssetWorks and responsible for managing our EV initiatives here, including the implementation of electric vehicle infrastructure projects in the field with many, many customers. And thank you to Bobbit for organizing this event. It's a very fun and timely topic to talk about lessons learned right now in a year like this with as many projects that have commissioned and are in the process of being commissioned. So just very pleased to be joining here today.
Wonderful. Now I'll hand it over for your presentation.
Fantastic. Well, again, pleasure to be here today. Pleasure to have the invite from the Bobbit team to talk about electrification. 2023 has been a historic year, certainly a memorable year for fleet. It is the first year that OEMs have had their order books open for EVs, class 1 through 8, and to some degree at least have also been delivering those vehicles. So it's been very exciting. And as a result, perhaps there have been as much learnings, as much progress on the technology side, as well as the best practice side in the last 12 to 18 months in the last 5 years or more. It's been very gratifying, I know, for our team to participate in so many exciting projects across the country, electrifying fleets, commissioning hardware, developing equipment strategies, and then ultimately integrating these technologies into different software systems and operational practices. It has not been a slow year by any means, not just for our team, but I think for everyone on this call as well. And so it is a unique opportunity now in November, coming up at the end of the year, to think about, as individuals, as organizations, as an industry, some of the best practices, some of the pain points, some of the things that have gone wrong that we've all collectively learned from. And I'm very pleased to be able to share our perspective, our team's perspective, and perhaps it's shared perspectives with those on the call of emerging best practices, and then open it up in the Q&A for a talk about everyone's different perspectives or questions, again, on hardware, on commissioning, on operational best practices, and more. Ultimately, there seems to be a shared vision amongst fleet organizations to have the flexibility to deploy multiple solutions across the organization, to use the best tool for each individual application, each vocation or duty cycle. And we see many organizations going through a learning process, a piloting process of deploying different charging solutions, for example, for workplace charging, for fleet depot charging, for public charging, sometimes expanding their fuel management scope to assist in other parts of the organization, and oftentimes deploying pretty new and novel technologies as a part of that process. And just to make sure we're all using the same language as we talk about this, there's a lot of different technology stacks or solutions that are involved in fleet electrification. EV chargers are ultimately an Internet of Things type device, right? No matter what brand it is or the hardware type or how it's configured. We have a hardware element. I love this visual. I use it all the time. We have a hardware element, and it's at the bottom layer here, that connects to a cloud application or software layer, and then ultimately integrates back into our back office systems. I'm an AssetWorks guy, so this is an AssetWorks example here, but the example should hold true for others, other systems that you may use, other back office or enterprise solutions. That we really have a lot of moving pieces to make these projects successful. One, selecting the hardware, developing an equipment strategy and commissioning it successfully and on time and with a high degree of uptime. Two, using the software that it's paired with effectively. And then three, the human element or the other organizational elements of bringing that data back into our existing management processes, reports, and day-to-day activities. So I say that just to make sure we're on sort of using the same vocabulary and thinking about the same big picture view of things. But we've all had and have participated in projects with different types of challenges. And, there's a risk of being a little myopic or negative about this sort of thing. But there's a lot of different sayings. I enjoy one. It's, it's not negative to buy an umbrella because it's going to rain. It's going to rain, so buy an umbrella. And in the same token, think about the things that can go wrong in an EV project, because this is a great planning exercise, either a great retrospective view or a great forward-looking view to be proactive around these concerns. And, some of the most common planning and operational pitfalls that we see: no activation of chargers. We'll talk about that in a moment. No service, no spares, no spare parts, that is, related to the question of service. No integration, no time. And I joke, but maybe it's a little serious. For some, no luck either. And we'll walk through these in a bit. There's more, but perhaps these are some of the most frequent or recurring issues that we see in organizations. And our team has the unique perspective, not only in commissioning charging hardware, but in helping organizations integrate that data to really do full audits and see how the equipment is functioning, how the software is being utilized, and how staff are responding to some of these changes. The first thing that we do when we integrate with a solution is do a sort of audit of the fleet charging operation and see what is happening on a day-to-day basis, the uptime, the commissioning status of existing chargers. And it's been a very surprising and revealing experience for us over the last 4 years or so. The surprising truth is that most fleets do not configure their charge management software after purchase. Almost all fleet leaders, though, think they do or have done that, but most fleets don't. Meaning that chargers are commissioned, but the software is never really configured or set up, even for things like basic access control. One of the most frequent stories we hear across the country, even in places that are very advanced and experienced in EV, is just surprised at the number of chargers within the organization that were never even commissioned for access control, where employees perhaps are, think they're waving a badge, but aren't actually initiating a charge. It's just set for open use. Things like charge scheduling, diagnostics and resets on chargers, invoicing even. There are a lot of potentials, a lot of capabilities built within the software. It's a reason why most organizations include this as a prerequisite in their RFPs and tenders. But surprisingly, for whatever reason, 90% of organizations never actually activate or use it. And so one of the things that we really do and have spent a lot of time starting to operationalize is taking time to go in 6 months, 3 months after go live and make sure that things actually are configured properly. And these are great stories to tell. I wish we could be more specific about them, but we're trying to provide some anonymity around these sort of experiences and case studies, but they're very, very common occurrences. And if you do have chargers in your fleet, it's something to think about perhaps this afternoon about whether or not those are actually fully activated or not. You may be surprised. The second category of best practice or learnings is definitely around service, specifically operations and maintenance. All chargers can break. Chargers are stationary assets. Sometimes they can be complex stationary assets. And just like vehicles or gensets or anything else that is purchased and deployed, they do require both preventative and unscheduled maintenance. However, most organizations are sold chargers with the idea that these are indestructible things. And that's not fair. If an F-150, even no matter how good a charger is, as an F-150 backs into it, it's still going to require some unscheduled maintenance. However, most organizations, by far the majority of organizations, do not have formal operations and maintenance plans for this equipment. It's one of the largest capital expenditures in the history of fleet, certainly within lifetimes, but most organizations don't have concrete formal O&M plans to service and maintain this equipment. despite the large capital outlays that are being made. And going back to the software, it is even rarer that organizations know how to run diagnostics. So it's interesting, as chargers have issues and difficulties, there's an ability to actually remotely reset chargers and adjust those without having to send a technician into the field. It's extremely rare that organizations request or receive training to use those software features to maintain high uptime and reduce their own internal service hours maintaining the equipment. Thirdly, or another concern, it's extremely rare too that organizations are satisfied with their local service techs. And so one challenge that I think many or most on this call have had is that regardless of whether the hardware and software are first in class or not, that it's very difficult or disappointing sometimes the quality of service techs that actually come out into the field. For example, from a consumer side, you may enjoy your relationship with Verizon or T-Mobile, but if a lousy tech comes to your home to service your modem, that's your exposure to that that brand and that product. And it doesn't have to be that way. One of the things in terms of best practices that we are really encouraging and promoting is the ability of fleets to select their own service techs or even self-train. One of the major industry trends that we are seeing and working through today is both a right to repair, meaning that chargers increasingly are designed for self-service, whether it be modular design or quick field service features, or the ability, meaning a productized approach to providing training for fleet and facility techs to maintain this equipment internally with organizations' own resources. Related to service is the question of spares. So all chargers break. That's sort of a mantra that we love to say and repeat again and again. But most organizations don't, A, have a service plan in place, and then B, don't necessarily have an ability in terms of spare parts to service. Again, the capital outlays for EV chargers are approaching or exceeding some fleet organizations' own vehicle purchasing budgets. And yet there's no provision for spare parts. And part of the reason for that has been over the last several years, particularly during COVID, severe parts shortages that have prevented organizations from being able to inventory spare parts like spare cables and things. That's beginning to change. And more organizations, particularly very savvy organizations that have been in this space for a couple of years now, are beginning to take that approach of buying their umbrella. They know it's going to rain. At some point, someone is going to vandalize a charger and steal a cable. So they're going to go ahead and buy that replacement cable or buy that replacement screen ahead of time so that they can have it on site. One of the lengthiest parts of the service process is scheduling a tech or shipping a spare part to the job site. By having spare parts on site and then also going back to this idea of having some internal capacity to service equipment, there's a really great potential for organizations to increase their uptime, minimize disruptions, and ultimately achieve the organization's goals of providing reliable and cheap EV charging for internal customers. And something that organizations can begin to ask about, particularly going into 2024, is whether or not their service providers can provide them that spare parts program, chargers with modular designs that are designed for self-service versus sending back to the factory or to their provider. And then again, those training programs to be able to do field service with little to minimal notice. The other consideration that keeps coming up again and again is integration. We're very passionate about integration. We're usually the ones who talk first about it and loudest about it at industry events. We definitely believe, and I think industry is beginning to also take the position that integration shouldn't be taken for granted or assumed. Not all charger brands integrate with all fleet information management software or can. Sometimes there's technical barriers to that. And even when integrations are offered, there are from time to time third-party integrations that have different trade-offs or considerations. Not all integrations may be built or structured the same based on feature sets and designs and partnership agreements. It's really great to be able to sit down with your third-party providers, whether it be a finance software provider, fleet information management software provider, or others, and understand before commissioning hardware, purchasing hardware, what is available out of the box, and also what recommendations may be provided. There are definitely best fit tools for certain use cases and vocations. And if you're able to work with a partner that can take that consultative approach and provide you with candid guidance, it can be a very clarifying conversation to have, hopefully early on, versus, again, after the fact, after commissioning a large amount of hardware and discovering potential gaps in support. And hardware matters. We talk a lot in this industry about OCPP and OCPI standards. But ultimately, when we go back to this idea of chargers as an Internet of Things device, it is the responsibility of the software provider, the cloud provider. You have a couple of brand names listed here. There's certainly many, many others in the industry, to make a decision to onboard that new type of hardware to their application and provide long-term care and support for it, right? There's a responsibility to adding new makes and models of chargers that those companies then become responsible for the uptime, firmware updates, and all the various individual quirks of different hardware OEMs. Some manufacturers or some cloud providers, software providers, may decline to add a certain type of charger, either because of its age, its characteristics, lack of certain OEM support. It's very, very good to have that conversation and look past the brochure capability and the brochure language of OCPP to understand really what is best fit, what's recommended, and what is going to serve the fleet organization best. And we talked about a lot of things: no parts, no spares, no service, no integrations. Sometimes one of the biggest barriers, of course, at this stage is no time. And we're all moving at the speed of EV, or attempting to move at the speed of EV. And I think all or anyone who has participated in an EV project over the last 24 months has gotten into this issue of getting hardware, of scheduling integration, of piloting hardware and partners, and then hopefully being able to adjust plans prior to scaling. One of the things that we've seen as an organization, and I'm curious to hear what people's approaches are. In fact, this could be something, if you want to put into the Q&A, whether you're doing this or not. Some organizations go full-blown in and will make 10-year commitments to work with a charging provider. Others are very much interested in doing a 12-month, a 24-month pilot before making these multi-decade or decade-long commitments. There's been different approaches made, and certainly it is good to plan ahead, but we've had a lot of different experience with organizations choosing to pilot versus make all-in-one commitments. And regardless of the approach, scheduling adequate time to have hardware deployed, to have integrations implemented, tested at small scale, and then scaled up, to pilot hardware and also the service partners that support it, and potentially adjust those plans before scaling to full size. These are all best practices, which as an industry, we're learning to adopt and develop further. So in a quick, some kind of closing thoughts here, in terms of planning and implementation lessons learned, it falls into a couple of buckets. First and foremost, either because we're visual people or not, equipment strategy comes to the forefront. There is a tremendous amount of opportunity, decision-making that can happen in this space with technology providers and partners. But where constraints start to fall into place is when organizations develop equipment strategy and specifications. Oftentimes, that's the first constraint that narrows the universe of software and partners that you'll work with later in the project. And so being able at an early stage to do adequate discovery and piloting, to understand what equipment is a best fit, and then hopefully commit in large scale is a best practice. There's a story in the industry trade press this week, for example, of a large multinational fuel retailer that deployed a certain brand of DC fast charger at their fuel and convenience sites in the United States. And less than 18 months after the fact of commissioning that six-figure hardware, is actually ripping and replacing it with another brand, right? These are some of the experiences that large organizations are having, that they commit in a pilot and then readjust. So thinking clearly and having clear learning objectives during a pilot stage as to what you're seeking as part of your equipment strategy is always highly, highly recommended. Sometimes those sort of rip and replace situations are unavoidable, but hopefully with adequate planning, they are. Integration. So timeline for integration continues to be a challenge. For some organizations, it can be a quick and streamlined process. For others, it can be a very long and extended one, depending on the number of EV chargers already deployed, meaning the scale of the implementation or integration, the different technology requirements, the layer cake of solutions already in the field, perhaps whether those back office solutions are hosted on-prem or not. All of these things can influence the timeline for integration. Some folks are able to go live with the charging integration in a single quarter. Some need to wait to implement that project because of other scheduling concerns for a year, and some do take a couple quarters to fully implement. So we always flag that as a concern. In terms of advanced functions, diagnostics, load management, and more, we really implore organizations, just because we've seen so many struggle with this, to think about that functionality during their pilot state. Many organizations commit to doing a pilot, but in practice don't really have the learning objectives formalized. The project is labeled a pilot, chargers are commissioned, some informal feedback is gathered, but the different features and functionality aren't fully tested. And it can be a surprise some years later when those things are turned on if they don't work all at once. These are excellent things to find and discover during the pilot phase. And if there's a moral in all this, it's that procurement is not the finish line. We love to say this again and again. Procurement is not the finish line. And there's a lot of fact-finding or truth-finding that needs to be done. Brochure capability is still a major concern in our industry, that many providers do dress themselves up, so to speak, to talk to fleets. EV charging is an industry that has by and large cut its teeth over the last 10 years, working with apartment buildings, workplaces, and public retail locations. Fleet is different, and many organizations present themselves as being ready to work with fleet vehicles and fleet use cases, but may fall short. There's a tremendous amount of progress being made amongst these vendors to implement fleet learnings and recommendations, but there's still gaps and new opportunities in 2024 to improve and implement, both on the technology vendor side as well as even within fleet organizations, to have better operations and maintenance best practices deployed. And so we really encourage organizations as part of their pilot process to be thinking critically, to be not just calling projects pilots in name, but really thinking about them as pilots with learning objectives, with criteria, success criteria, before committing to full-scale deployment. There is no end to the number of questions and test cases and different internal customer needs that can be evaluated. We really encourage organizations to take that mature approach to the business and really kick the tires, so to speak, on their EV chargers. So again, very appreciative to the Bobbitt team for the opportunity to wave a flag and say that this is an exciting time for the industry, but it's also, for some organizations, a very perilous or stressful time. It doesn't have to be. There's some great resources out there. The technology is always getting better, but it is helpful to have opportunities to talk about it in plain language, like today, or at other Bobbitt events like Fleet Forward and GFX, et cetera. So again, thank you to the Bobbitt team, and would love to respond to any Q&A that may have gone into the chat.
Thank you, Mike, for that valuable information. And yes, we do have a few questions that came in. So one of them is, Are there any examples of gold plating level 2 chargers or bad specifications to avoid?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's something that's coming up more and more. Something that is a discovery for many fleet organizations, many fleet leaders, is that not all EVs can charge as fast as their chargers can provide, right? And that is true both for level 2 and for DC fast chargers. You may purchase a 180 kilowatt DC fast charger. You may purchase an 80 amp level 2 charger. It's unlikely that all of your vehicles will be able to charge that fast. And so we do encourage organizations to think not just about the dwell time of the vehicle and their average daily use, but really just what's actually necessary for their use case. So for example, 80 amp level 2 chargers are great. We recommend them for high mileage light trucks like F-150s, certain box trucks, et cetera. But most vehicles, including Teslas, including transit, connect vans, including most sedans, can only charge up to 50 amps or 48 amps, right? So you may wish to deploy an 80 amp charger. It could certainly be an example of future proofing, but based on your dwell time, based on other use cases, it could be, and gold plating is a strong word, but it could definitely be more capacity than what you need. And it could also be driving up costs on your facility make-ready side, right? So you may be telling your facility team that you need 20 80 amp chargers. Each one of those 80 amp ports is going to require a 100 amp breaker in the panel. That could be really over-engineered and driving up different kinds of panel or transformer costs that could be unnecessary when your fleet ops could be very well served by a 50 amp charger, which doesn't require the panel upgrade potentially or the larger breaker, but meets the full charging capacity of the vehicle. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and I have another question that kind of goes along with that. What are some characteristics for a good or trusted EV charging network provider?
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of ways to approach that. I think ultimately there's a human factor, right? You're going to be doing something new for the first time. It's going to be a technically complex project. It's almost a guarantee or a promise that there's going to be some sort of problem, challenge, or learning gap that happens along the way. It's great to have a partner that is well-resourced, right? So there's a lot of small, large organizations in the marketplace providing EV charging or advertising EV charging solutions. Finding an organization, perhaps regardless of size, that's going to be able to give you the resources you need and the responsiveness that you need is key. Sometimes there's a perception that the grass is greener on the other side. I think you're going to find that every organization is rapidly progressing their technology and their service packages. Choose the people that you like to work with. And once you figure out that universe of people that you like to work with, ask questions also such as, does this solution integrate back into my back office systems? Is the implementation of this software going to be more disruptive than what is necessary to my fleet ops and my fuel management practice? Do these technology products understand the fleet use case? Am I happy with the service packages that are being offered? These are all high-level questions that can be asked during an interview or discovery process that will probably lead to more questions and more conversation, but excellent starting points to have.
All right, here's another one. How common is it for organizations to rip and replace chargers before the end of useful life?
Yeah, well, it happens. It happens. People don't like to talk about it. It's very, sure. and sometimes it's a politically, it's sort of a third rail. We've had conversations with that with many organizations. I don't know who's on this call, but if you're one of those folks,
Hello.
Hello. Yep. Thinking about that conversation. The idea is that, we're at a point though, where there's just a tremendous need for charging within the organization. Right. And sometimes those rip and replace projects can sap momentum, strength, and resources away from the overall initiative. So you may want to do a rip and replace. Sometimes that is needed and desired. In other cases, you may be an organization that just needs to push forward on the green grass and focus on getting the green grass right? It all depends. It's very individualistic. It probably depends on what's leading you to think about ripping and replacing. The good news is that when it comes time to do that, either because of the equipment aging past its useful life or a vendor change or some sort of service issue, that the majority of your cost is actually everything up to the stub out, right? It's your panel upgrade, it's the trenching, it's the conduit, it's all of the concrete and asphalt work that has to happen, right? It's the bollards and such. So when you do have to do that switching cost, it's not as bad as when you first installed and commissioned the hardware, because you're really just putting a new pedestal and charger head on. So there's that, but it can be a sensitive topic. Certainly within the organization, if you've gone to bat with a vendor and then 2 years later are talking about embarrassing. Sometimes there's no way to get around it. But talk to your partners and see what they can do. Some have different packages to make it a little more seamless, painful, and less painful and discreet. These are, unfortunate conversations, but conversations that everyone probably has at some point. And again, I was really shocked this week looking at that large retail and convenience store company saying that they're going to rip out their DC fast chargers after just about 18 months of use. Another EV charging network company made a similar announcement about ripping out hardware that was put in really just in 2020, so 3 years, maybe going on 4 years. That's far less than the useful life of the equipment. So again, do discovery with your providers, figure out what your requirements are, your preferences are, ask 6 people to your left, 6 people to your right, what their experiences have been, and have that clarity before you go into this, because the hardware is not cheap. And going over and doing a retrofit is not a fun thing to do if you don't have to do it.
Right. Now, what industry specifications matter and which ones are less relevant when going to RFP?
Sure. Yeah. Sometimes it's word salad, right? And we all want to show our technical proficiency, and maybe sometimes it's to be a little crude, it's sort of a CYA mindset in terms of putting every industry spec and standard. But, there's a few things to keep in mind. First and foremost, and I think at this point in the industry, we're all there in terms of hardware, but making sure that hardware is OCPP. There's still a few manufacturers out there that, believe it or not, and they try to, not as public, but don't have an OCPP hardware or software solution. Most do at this point. It'd be pretty rare not to. So having a basic requirement for OCPP. The one thing to perhaps be careful about is being more specific than that. So there's going to be continued updates to those standards. Right now we have, for example, an OCPP 1.6J and a 2.0.1 standard. Both are being used. One is very new and actually is still being revised, the 2.0.1 standard. I would suggest that you consider simply requiring OCPP because those versions will continue to revise. And your functional requirements may not necessitate doing one or the other. Ultimately, most hardware that you purchase, particularly in 2024, is going to be either 1.6J or 2.0.1 compatible. So simply recommending OCPP is probably sufficient for RFP purposes. It will allow you to capture a full range of offerings, regardless of whether a certain provider is on 2.0.1 or 2.1 or 1.6J. From a fleet perspective, again, probably not the most relevant at this time. That will perhaps change in coming years, but not something to dwell on too much. Other standards, OCPI, et cetera, they're good and important. But from an integration perspective, if that's your priority in recommending OCPI, it's less about that as it is what partnerships do they have, right? Because OCPI is great, but there's still a certain amount of development work that has to happen on top of that to work with your finance partner, to work with your FIMS partner, et cetera. So I wouldn't go too crazy with the alphabet soup if you don't have to.
What about planning considerations? How can they be made for dealing with power outages? Are there any common pitfalls or issues with that?
Sure. Yeah, it's an exciting kind of previously an edge case as the number of EVs was small. It's continuing to grow. And if there's 5 EVs in the fleet and the power goes out, life goes on. If there's more than that, it becomes more of a challenge. And so something that organizations can do early, particularly during the pilot stage, is start to think about contingency planning around not just power outages in general, but the different types of power outages that you may experience. Meaning you can have a quick flicker where the power goes on and off and everything gets reset. You may have a power outage of several hours. You may have a power outage that is for several days, and certainly your consideration, your planning considerations will be very different around each. If it's a power outage that simply is restored within a couple hours, you may want to talk to your provider about what kind of automatic resets your software can do for you. That tends to be something that's more available with level 2 than DC fast charge. But to ask about that, if it's a concern about power out being for a couple hours or for a single night, you may wish to consider about how often vehicles are charging, what your daily mileage is. Most vehicles don't need to charge every night. So perhaps that really isn't as pressing of a concern if the power is back on in the morning and you have some DC fast chargers to top off. But if it's a longer duration or it's a very mission critical operation, you may wish to even consider different kind of energy storage operations, be it a genset or battery energy storage, to have continuity of operations. And so again, it's a very case-specific, organization-specific conversation. But if you're working with the right partners, if you're working with partners that understand your needs and understand fleet, it's a conversation that most and all are, I think, ready to have with you when you're ready.
Thank you for that, Mike. That is all the time that we have for today. But for anyone who asked a question that wasn't answered, we will be following up via email to answer your questions individually. We hope that you all enjoyed today's webinar. I want to again thank Mike and AssetWorks for today's presentation. I also did want to mention that this webinar will be available on demand on the Government Fleet website at governmentfleet.com/webinars. Thank you, Mike, and all of you for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks to the BABA team, and good luck on your EV projects all.